I see trees of green.
Firstly, thanks to Rowan for his great introduction to the underpinnings of the fundamentals of tree measurement and growth. Because what I want to do is sort of take it from there to look at our plantation, and not just measurement but monitoring. Measurement you do once, so to speak. Monitoring you do multiple times and then see where it's leading you. The data I'm going to use comes from annual reports that we get from our forest managers, Heartwood Plantations. You'll be listening to Clinton Temper a little bit later in this program, and he used to work for Heartwood, and he did the establishment of our Thornton plantation and also the Canberra plantation. And every year around this time of year we get this annual management report from Heartwood. They give us the basic details and repeat it every year, but basically what they're talking about is our plantation at Canberra, which is about 50 hectares of planted trees, but with 5 different main species: blue gum, spotted gum, stringy bark, sugar gum, other, which is mostly a combination of ironbark and other density trees, which we're really growing not for form, but for experimentation in many ways. You'll see them up on the highest elevations of the tree farm this afternoon. Their report gives us lots of information to start with, and one thing they include every year is the annual rainfall. And that in itself is very useful. Rowan was talking about, why do we get a wide growth ring one year? Well, it may be because we had good rain that year and it enabled more growth. You can see at Canberra we've had 3 very good rainfall years above 1100 mil. The average is about 700, and sometimes it's been down around 500. So you have your wet and your dry years where the rainfall can vary by more than a factor of 2. And looking back at this graph, when we look at the growth charts later, sometimes gives you an inkling as to why something happened rather than just it's the trees. It could have been the weather. But the most important table in the reports is this one, which we get every year, and this is from last year's report, showing the different species. The second column shows the permanent sampling plot. And we've talked about those permanent sampling plots, and we've actually got 9 different sampling plots spread amongst our different crops. 3 in the blue gum, 2 in the spotted and the sugar gum, 1 in the stringy bark, and 1 in what we call the red ironbark, which is up around the higher elevations. And each year they go out and they measure the stocking rate, the average diameter per expressed height, the average height, and they're really the measurements that they do. The rest is sort of calculations. But the 3 most important things every year are the stocking, the diameter, and the height, from which we can then calculate a number of other parameters of growth. I'm going to look at the moment particularly at the blue gum side of things, because that's the one that's been subjected to more silviculture. But I'll make a commentary about the spotted gum and the sugar gum at the very end to follow up with something that Rowan was saying there as well. Of all those measurements, the DBH is the most critical of those measurements, because many other things are related to the DBH. This is just from our blue gums, where we've plotted DBH against average height. For the first 10 years, it was virtually a straight line, that the height in metres was the same as the DBH in centimetres. And in the last year, it's gone a little bit off that, but it's a very predictable shape. And if we continued on as the trees grow further, we'd find a very predictable shape. And for the statisticians among you, it would be a very high R squared. I know one statistician would understand that. It's a very good relationship. It's not much scatter around that line. And that applies not just to the height, but to lots of other measurements. If you know the DBH, because it's related to height, and as Rowan was saying, once you know how big it is here and you know how high it is, you can calculate all sorts of things. So if you know the DBH, it's the most critical. It actually forms the basis of what's called allometric modelling. Being an old academic, modelling is very important to my life. But all that is just estimating these other measures of growth via some equations, very simple maths. like A equals B plus C, or B multiplied by C, or something very simple. And so I've used that to develop a whole bunch of relationships, taking the data that Heartwood has provided every year for the last 13 years, analyse those 13 years, and then I'll talk about what might happen in the next years. So if we start with that Heartwood data, what I want to do is take you through the journey of those blue gum trees for the last 13 years, and then look a little bit into the future, what might happen as we do various things. Well, one of the things that's happened there is that we've had two things. In around 2013, we did a first, what they call a thinning to waste. That is, the trees that you take out, you don't bother trying to sell them, you just leave them on the ground. They rot away very quickly because they're generally very small trees, and you'll see that this afternoon. You then let them grow on for a while, and then in 2018-19, we did what was called a commercial thinning. The trees are now big enough that you can actually sell them for some purpose. And hopefully, the money you get back from selling them will cover the cost of the thinning. Not always. You'll notice that in the non-thin periods that the curves do show a bit of a downtrend in each of those flat areas, and that's just natural mortality. Trees die. Some of the trees you're measuring carcass. And so that happens, you just accelerate the dying when you do the thinning. It's like tree euthanasia. Okay, so we've had that reduction in stock rate over the years. During that same period, the average diameter growth has continued. And if you compare that back to the previous graph where the thinning took place, you can see a couple of points where the growth rate seems to have spurted. But you need to be careful in interpreting what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean that the thinning has induced the trees, the remaining trees, to get bigger. It could be a pure statistical fact that if you cut out the small trees in the plantation and then measure the average diameter, well, you're measuring the diameter of bigger trees who are left there. So you'll get an increase in the average simply by cutting out the small trees. It's like the old thing is, if an Irishman immigrated to England, it'd simultaneously raise the IQ of both Ireland and England. So that's sort of what we're looking at here. Maybe. We really don't know whether it's increased the growth of the remaining trees until you get a bit more data after the thinning to see whether this temporary spike continues on as the remaining trees actually do grow in quicker. But while thinning gives you fatter trees, it also reduces your basal area. Remember, the basal area is the number of trees times the average diameter. You multiply that up to get the total area. And whilst each individual tree might grow a bit bigger, if you cut out half of them, which is what we did that first time, it's about 50% reduction, then you're going to end up with less basal area in total. So in the times when we had the thinning, you can see that the basal area drops down and then starts to grow again. Average height is not so affected by thinning. It just continues on. You can, if you've got very good eyesight, you can maybe detect a slight change, but by and large, it just continues growing higher. Rowan was talking about the idea of a conical tree. So if you know the basal area and you know the height, you can calculate the volume of that cone. We use a slightly different method using one of these allometric equations where people have actually cut trees down, measured the diameter of different heights, etc., 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 measured the volume, and it's not quite a cone. As Rowan was saying, it's got some different shapes, and different species will have different shapes. And so this is for blue gum, to estimate the stem volume. But what you can see is the stem volume grows, drops off when we thin, and starts growing again, drops off, etc. It's the total volume across the plantation, so it's metres cubed per hectare. Okay, so we got into measuring this forest measurements now, not per tree, but per hectare. Oh, I should mention the coloured dots on there. The black line is the average across the 3 permanent sampling plots. The coloured dots are each of the sampling plots, PSP 1, 2 and 3. So there is a little bit of difference in all of the sampling plots because it's a sample and you'll always get sampling error, but the average gives a pretty reasonable indication.
Tony, you notice where the thinning occurred, the first one in 2013. You dropped the volume, but you got it all back within a year. So this notion that you're losing something by hanging out, you're back to where you were in volume, but it's on half the number of trees. So you sort of look at that recovery time, and the big thinning that was done in 2019, that's probably be back this year to what it was before. Again, same volume on less number of trees.
Now, what we're looking at in the last graph is total stem volume per hectare. There are a couple of different ways you can look at that change in volume. You look at the change in volume. One is called the current annual increment. That is, in this year, how much did the stem volume change? The total stem volume change. And we can see the thinning years because in those years there was actually a negative change. We lost stem volume. But then it came back up to what we were doing in previous years, and then we lost again, and we did the bigger thinning, the thinning of bigger trees, and then it's come back up again, and who knows where it's going to go after this. Another thing you can look at is the mean annual increment, MAI, and that's if you look at the stem volume in a particular year, year X, whatever that is, 3rd year, 5th year, 10th year, if you divide the stem volume by the number of years, then that'll show you how it's changing over time. It's like a moving average of the stem volume. And again, you can see the effect of the thinning. It drops it down, but it doesn't go negative. You've still got stem volume there to average across, and it drops down again and it starts to go up again. So it's all just giving you different perspectives on what's happening as the trees grow, as they're thinned as part of silviculture. The trees, as you mentioned, have also been pruned, so that by this time they've now had 3 pruning lifts, 2 metres, 4 metres and 6 metres. So now these remaining trees that we're planning to carry on, most of them have got a clear 6 metres with no branches, and they were taken off earlier than that so we don't have branch roots into them. So they'll be good quality timber. We get a 6 metre log out of it. Let me divert. We've been talking about trees and wood so far, but as you know, carbon is one of my interests. And one interesting thing is that carbon is stored in more than the stem. So far we've just been talking about that trunk, the stem of the tree. But there's more to the tree than just the stem. In fact, if we didn't have the other things, we wouldn't have a stem, as Rowan said. If we didn't have leaves on the top, you'd have no tree below, etc. So this is, again, allometric surveys which have looked at the different components of the tree, the leaves, the branches, the stem and the roots, and see what proportion of the total volume of the tree is comprised of each of those components. And when the trees are very young, that is, they've got small, that's the diameter here, so 10 centimetre diameter, going up to what we're aiming for, 60. When they're small, the roots actually have got more in them than the stem, or about the same anyway. But as the tree gets bigger, proportionally the roots get smaller. They don't actually get smaller, they get proportionally smaller as the total volume of the tree, and more of the tree now goes into the stem itself. The leaves and the branches stay at a relatively constant, relatively small level. But the point is that carbon is stored in all of those components. It's not just in the stem. And if we look at the sequestration of CO2, carbon dioxide in the tree, which is an active process, it's what happens every year. The tree absorbs the CO2 through photosynthesis. The carbon is stored, the carbon, not the carbon dioxide, the carbon is stored in the tree And the oxygen out of the carbon dioxide gets released back to the atmosphere. And you can see that the carbon sequestration also varies in very similar ways to the current annual increment for the timber, and showing the dips in the thinning years. In those 2 years, we sequestered negative carbon. We took more out than the trees took in. We took more out by cutting down those trees than what the trees took in. But again, they recovered in following years. Whereas the storage of the carbon in the tree, it's the carbon out of the CO2 that gets stored in the tree, that's like the cumulative effect. The carbon that was absorbed last year, and the year before, and the year before that, is all still in the tree, being stored. And that continues to increase, but with the dips when you had the thinning. Now, this is where I find it gets interesting. How much are these plantation products worth? And I stand to be corrected on some of these numbers because they're all as variable as the day is long. Saw logs, the mythical figure is about $100 net per tonne. How does that go with your figures, right? Is that about rightish? More ballparkish?
Yeah, I paid myself about that.
The pulp or the firewood, they both go for around $30 net per tonne. And when I say net, this is what you as a tree farmer or tree grower will get back after you've paid for the harvesting, after you pay for the transport, you paid your agent, whatever else you've got to pay, you will get something back. Carbon credits, currently about $30 per tonne of CO2. But remember that each tonne of wood sequesters more than a tonne of CO2. I mentioned that these numbers are variable. This is just the carbon price, carbon credit price, the Australian carbon credit unit price. The spot price on the voluntary market. So it's not the money that the government pays for the carbon credits, it's what companies, private interests pay for carbon credits to offset their own emissions. And this is on a spot market. A month ago, they were trading for about $57 per tonne. Then Russia invaded Ukraine, and the price fell to about 45. Probably because a lot of industries thought, oh, that's a good diversion. People will be worried about war in Ukraine now, so we won't worry too much about climate change for a while. And then they dropped from 45 down to $30 a tonne, and that was the Australian government changing the rules of the carbon credit unit. I won't go into the details there, but they basically ended up swamped the market with carbon credits, hence the average price fell. So I'm using this figure as a lower estimate for where it'll go in the future. It'll rise again as demand increases. Okay, so applying those prices to the growth and the amounts before, what we're looking here is how much does each product earn as an asset? The saw logs, the pulp and the CO2. Well, the saw logs don't kick in until roughly 10 years in because they haven't got big enough yet to be worth a saw log. Now I've put a minimum diameter, small end diameter of 12 centimetres. So it's that much at the top of the thing and probably that much down at the breast height. It's a pretty small saw log, but you could do something with it. You could get 4-inch boards out of it or things like that. But it's not really worth much. When we thinned it, we took a lot of those trees out so we can't count them anymore, and they started to grow again. Until that time, anything we grew was just for pulp. But as these became saw logs, we got less pulp, or firewood. Along the way, the carbon credits were going through. They got a dip when we thinned, another dip when we thinned. And this would be the value of these things if we harvested at that year. If we harvested the logs at that year, that's what we get for them. Once you've harvested and sold it for saw logs, you didn't get anything before then, you won't get anything after. But the carbon credits come in each year. So if you look at the cumulative income, that is added up year by year, because the carbon is being paid every year based on how much growth there was in that year, but the saw logs and the pulp will only be credited when you cut them down. And if we cut them down this year, this is what we would have got.
How many hectares is that?
This is 13 hectares. This is just for our blue gums, it's 13 hectares in total. Okay, so that's where we would be now. Question, what might happen in the future? Because like all tree farmers, you've got to think of, well, what do we do now? What are we looking forward to? Should we invest now? Should we do this? Should we do that? So on. So what I've used is the monitoring data up to date and the allometric models that have been created and so on. And look forward, assuming a few things, assuming a 30-year rotation. So we're going to harvest in 2037. Got to be willing. We're assuming one more thinning to 150 stems per hectare in 2028. Now that thinning, the 150 stems in the 2028 are a bit arbitrary, but sort of reasonable. Assuming the DBH increases linearly from what we have now up to our golden target of 60 centimetres diameter when we harvest. A reason I've taken that is everyone says we've got to get something like 60 centimetres to make it worthwhile. So I say, well, let's assume we get it. And let's assume the height goes up. These are pretty tall trees. You were saying that maybe we'll get 25 to 30, I agree. But as you say, height is not all that important. Because you're only going to take the bottom 6 metres for your sawlog anyway. So, what might we have? This is the cumulative income from the sawlogs, the pulp and the carbon credits from 30 years up till 2037. So it's the same as the diagram we've already seen, but it's extending it out to 2037, a 30-year rotation. And we can see in this graph that the value of the sawlogs might be something like 320,000 at the end of that 30 years. The pulp would be about 140,000, and the cumulative value of the carbon credits, which have been accruing year by year, has risen to about 390,000 by the end of the 30 years.
So Tony, that's the incremental carbon sequestered each year.
It's the cumulative effect of each year's sequestration,
Yeah.
which if you're buying carbon credit or registering some carbon credits and selling the credits, that'll be income you're getting from selling the credits.
What's the level of time that you need to keep the tree standing for carbon credits before it negates being used as a sawlog?
Currently, the AWCU system requires 25 years.
So after 25 years, you can harvest
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to go into a 25-year contract. And if you harvest before that, for whatever reason, maybe you have to for some reason, then you just pay back the credits. Similarly, because what we've effectively been doing here, when you've got these dips here, that's when you're effectively paying back the carbon units because of the trees you took out and the carbon you took out. Okay,
But
so
that's figuratively on paper, it's not actually.
Oh no, it'll be real thing.
It is actually.
It is a real transaction.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the thing, you've got to pay money for the contractor and also
And the carbon.
And that's not included in here. So I haven't put any contractor cost in here for actually doing the work.
But you have to in effect pay a carbon tax when you think.
Well, you're paying back the carbon credits you said you created and sold. Then the monitoring process that goes on in the background, they'll come out and measure again, and now you've got only half the carbon you said you had last year, so you have to pay that back. So in the end, sawlogs provide about 38% of the total income, the pulp about 17%, and the carbon about 46%. So it's relatively evenly balanced between the wood products and the carbon credits over the 30 years rotation. Now, all these dollar values are just dollar values in those years. Interestingly, while the carbon builds up in the early years, the two wood products you don't get till 30 years down the track. So we use the concept of discounted cash flow, which is basically just saying people would rather receive money now than receive it in 30 years' time. So there are various rates you can use. We apply what the government often uses in projects, 40% per year. Every year the value of your money will drop by 4%. And if that's the case, then all these numbers that I showed before will go down.
The carbon credits are now only worth $170,000 after the 30 years in discounted terms. That is what it's worth to us now. But the other values also go down. So the saw logs are worth about $90,000 in present value terms, and the pulp is worth about $40,000. So there's still a relative difference, and in fact the difference is more in favour of the carbon, which comes in the early years. So that now the saw logs are worth 31% of the total income, the pulp about 13%, and the carbon has risen to 56% of the total income because you get that stream of income early on.
So all I'm trying to say is the following. Monitoring data is essential if you want to know where you are going. Okay, you've got to know where you want to go, and you've got to know whether you're getting there. I'm suggesting that carbon credits can be a major source of ongoing income, and importantly from my point of view, which help to pay to keep the plantation in top condition. I'm facing a dilemma at the moment because as a retiree, after my business stopped 10 years ago, I'm facing great difficulty in paying the contractor to do the thinning, whether I want to or not. So if I'd been able to get income along the way on a continual basis, I would have had money to be able to keep that plantation in absolute top condition. Sadly, Canumba was planted too early to benefit from the current carbon credit programs. They will allow plantations which were planted after 2010. Ours were planted in 2008. But then again, we thought the emissions trading scheme was going to be passed in 2009. There's a clause called additionality. What it says is you shouldn't be paid for carbon credits if you're going to plant the trees anyway. For example, if you planted the trees a long time ago before carbon credits were even thought of, they're saying, well, why should we be paying for something that's already there? We planted our trees specifically for carbon, but we just did it too early. So, sadly, the number doesn't scream it, but if I was starting again, if I was planting trees this year, I'd definitely consider carbon credits as part of the portfolio of benefits from a tree farm. Because not only because of the scale of the income from it, but the timing, so that you actually get some income along the way to help you meet the costs of achieving all your other objectives. Whether those are objectives of getting wood, or habitat, or controlling salinity, or all those other reasons why you might plant trees, it's all very good to have those ambitions if you've got the money to pay for it. And so, to me, apart from the environmental issues, carbon credits give you that money to pay for those other objectives. Now, there was a question, do we insure? Can you insure your trees? We have not insured our trees yet. And the reason is when we started the plantations, we asked a lot of companies who insure plantations, can we get insurance for one of these tree farms? And they said, yeah, no worries. Modest premiums, etc., etc. The premium was about 4% of the value of the plantation per year. And we just did a quick non-theoretical calculation, 4% times 25 years is 100%. And we thought, well, if we insure our trees across the entire rotation, we're going to give away all potential income that we might have got from it to the insurance company. Just on the off chance the trees burn down. If the trees burn down, well, if they burn down early, it's not really worth much. And the longer the trees stay there, it's worth more, but the premium will go up. So we have not insured the trees. We will re-look at that when we get closer to harvest time. Once we get to about 20, 25 years thereabout-ish, we'll think, well, it really would be a bugger now if they burnt down.
Well, what happens with the carbon credit scheme if they burn down in year 24?
That's one of the things you insure against. Yeah, you'd have to pay it back. But then again, there's no free lunch.
Stuart mentioned earlier, when he was talking about the thinning of a plantation, that not only do you have to pay back any carbon that's sequestered at that time, but you also have to pay for the cost of the thinning. And I mentioned at that stage that hadn't been considered in the previous discussion. I'd only considered the income from the various products, the wood and the carbon. But clearly one needs to look at the costs as well as the income to get an overall picture. And that's what I'd like to do in this section in talking about an economic evaluation of farm forestry. The previous analysis has shown that carbon credits can make a substantial contribution to income over the life of the plantation, and that importantly they bring some of that income early in the life of the plantation. However, I guess the question is, can the wood and or the carbon provide sufficient income to offset the costs involved in establishing and maintaining a farm forestry plantation? Let's look at that question using some of the actual costs incurred in establishing and maintaining the plantation at Penumbra, along with the projected income and future costs that we might be seeing. So, what sort of expenses have we incurred in establishing the farm forestry plantation at Penumbra? Well, firstly, there's the land costs. We actually bought the land, as I said earlier, with our self-managed superannuation company. But from the point of view of this evaluation, we won't include the cost of the land because the land, in a sense, retains its value over the life of the plantation and beyond. Once the plantation is harvested, then one can sell the land. So it's not really a cost of the plantation itself. However, there are some land costs that are actual costs to the plantation, and that's things like the annual rates that are paid on that land. More directly, there are pre-planning costs in terms of digging soil pits, checking various things as to whether the land will be a suitable plantation site. And if all that goes according to plan, then you have the cost of establishing the plantation. And that includes things like the ripping and mounding, the pre-plantation weed control, the actual planting itself. Then the long haul begins, and over the next 25 to 30 years, you're then involved in various silviculture costs with thinning, pruning, and a range of other issues to keep the farm forestry plantation in good health. There are other costs involved, particularly when looking forward to the harvesting or the thinning stage. For example, to ensure that the internal roading on the plantation is going to be satisfactory for getting harvesting trucks in and out of the plantation. Also, just during the life of the plantation itself, it's very important to make sure that you do have access to the various components of the plantation. If you're doing agistment, then you may well need to think about improvement of fencing as well, and that's a cost that's associated with the farm forestry itself. There are also a series of admin costs. There might be administrative costs involved in accounting, legal issues, registration of companies, and so on. And if you're not doing the work yourself, then you may need to employ a farm forester to do a range of jobs involved with the silviculture, the monitoring, the measurements, and so on. And then finally, if you do wish to seek carbon credits, then there will be carbon auditing costs. The exact extent of that and the frequency of that is still open to question, but we'll make some assumptions about some of those costs as we go through this next evaluation. As we've said, there is income to be derived from farm forestry as well. And so the ones we've talked about already, saw logs at the time of harvest. It could be firewood from thinnings and from harvesting, and or pulp thinnings and harvesting. It really just depends on what the markets are at the time of the thinning and the harvesting. There could also be other timber products, particularly at the thinning stage. There may be markets for posts and rails for local farmers, and a range of other things, other wood products that could be available at the thinning and harvesting stage. We've mentioned carbon credits, and clearly that could be a major issue. If you're adjusting livestock, then there could be fees that you'll earn by adjusting someone else's livestock. And there may be other products that are associated with the farm forestry. Keeping bees, either for your own use or allowing others to keep bees on your property. The coppice after thinning could be used for native oils. We'll concentrate on just 4 of those particular types of income: the saw logs, firewood or pulp, and the carbon credits, as we've done in the previous analysis. We've kept a running tally of all the expenses we've incurred at Penumbra, and so the expenses in the period from 2008 to 2021, and this is just for the 13.9 hectares of blue gums. We've proportioned some of the costs across the different types of species to make this analysis realistic. If we look at the expenses incurred in those various years, then we see we have some admin costs, some management costs, and after 2014, those management costs were actually offset by adjustment, which has met the cost of the management of the plantation. There's roading costs that we had when first establishing the plantation and also before the major thinning. The planting costs up front, the rates, which just show a continual increase over time, and the silviculture, which is actually the largest of all the costs. And that occurs at the early, middle and late stages of the plantation. And one can see that for this 13.9 hectares of blue gums at Penumbra, over those first 13 years, there's been a total expenditure of something like $100,000. And this can be shown graphically here, that there's a major upfront cost for the plantation establishment, but then there are continuing costs, and particularly for silviculture, at various points during those 13 years. If you express that as a cumulative cost, you can see that the costs rise but then tend to flatten out over time. And this is for the 30 years of the entire plantation now, from 2008 to 2037. Most of your costs are going to be up front. On the other hand, if you're looking at income, as we've said before, the wood income comes at the end of that 30-year period. Unlike the costs which come early, the income from wood comes late, and that poses certain cash flow issues. When you put those two things together, you can see the clear differentiation in both timing and magnitude. The income is much greater in those later stages, but to get to those later stages, you've got to outlay the expenses that are going to occur early and over the period of the rotation. You put those two things together from a cumulative point of view and look at the net cash flow, that is how much money is going in or out of your system, then you can see that for the first basically 30 years, you're a negative cash flow. You've paid more money out than you've got in. And it dips to about 100,000 that you need to put in before you can get to that stage of earning income from the wood. If you're going to be seeking carbon credits, then the projected expenses are just a little bit different. You have all the costs that you would have had if you're going only for the wood products. Assuming you're going for both wood products and carbon, you'll have to do all the silviculture and so on as well. But you will have the auditing costs for the carbon credits. As I say, it's uncertain and there are changes that happen over time, what I've assumed is that every 5 years there will be an audit, and that the total cost for the entire farm forestries will be $20,000 each 5 years. For the blue gums, we've assumed 25% of that is attributed to the blue gums. That audit cost could be high or low. We may end up spending more or less than that in reality, but it's a good estimate at the moment, particularly to put it in the context of the income that will be earned, then what are the audit costs that need to be incurred. If you look at the cumulative expenses under a carbon credit scheme, then it's pretty much the same as before, except that whilst you have a lot of upfront costs, the ongoing costs are just slightly higher because of those ongoing carbon audits. The cumulative carbon income, we've mentioned before, will be increasing over time because you're earning carbon income every year, but there will be some dips when you have the thinning. Earlier we've talked about 2 rounds of thinning, and now we're including a 3rd round at around year 20. So you can see that there are dips incurred there, but overall the carbon income continues to increase. And if you put that carbon income against the total cost of earning that income, you can see a very different pattern from what we saw with just the wood income. Here we do have the expenses in the red line and the income in the green, and for the first 20 years or so they're comparable. They're about the same order of magnitude. Initially the income is a little bit less than the expenses, but after about year 15 the income, cumulative income, exceeds the cumulative expenses. So if we look at the net cash flow under that carbon credit scenario, you do have a negative cash flow for the first 15 years, but a relatively modest net cash flow deficit of about 50,000, 20 to 50,000. But after year 15, you're then in the black because the carbon income is exceeding the cost per year for each of the remaining 15 years. So if we compare the wood-only scenario versus the wood plus carbon scenario, we can see that the wood and carbon option includes the extra costs of periodic auditing, but it also provides that extra income from the carbon credits which offset those auditing costs, more than offset those auditing costs. In addition, the carbon credits have the advantage of delivering income throughout the life of the project and not just at the end. Whilst the wood income at the end of the project may be large, you have to wait a long time, and that may pose significant cash flow problems. So, given that, how do the wood and carbon plantations compare economically to wood-only plantations as a whole? A common way of comparing alternatives is to calculate the internal rate of return for each project. And you may have heard of internal rate of return, but what does it actually mean? Well, we've talked about discount rates before, and what the internal rate of return is, it's that discount rate which just equates the sum of the discounted income streams with the sum of the discounted expense streams. And it shows you what sort of interest rate, if you want to think about that, what sort of interest rate your expenditures will return in terms of income. If we look at the wood-only internal rate of return, we can, for each of the 30 years, list the expenses that will be incurred and the income in nominal terms, and then discount those values for each year using a variable discount rate. And as we change the discount rate, we'll see the relative size of the total discounted income and the total discounted expenses. We'll see them change, and at some point they will be equal, as you can see in the yellow highlighted sections at the bottom of this table. At this discount rate, the expenses and the income have equal values for over the total 30 years, and that gives us our internal rate of return. We can do the same thing for the wood and carbon income streams, putting down the expenses and the income for each of the 30 years, and then discounting that under a different rate of discount until we get the discounted income and the discounted expenses being the same. And if we look at those 2 points where we get that equality, we see that the internal rate of return for the wood only option is 5.9% per annum. For the wood and carbon option, it's 11.6% per annum. Now you can think about those two percentages in the following way. It's what return do you get on an investment? If you put money into the bank now and earn a certain rate of interest per year, then what rate would you get from each of those investments? What this is saying is that the wood only option gives you 5.9% per annum, which is not bad compared to interest rates at the moment on the market. Interest rates at the moment are just 1 or 2%. But wood and carbon gives you essentially double the rate of return compared to the wood only. And that's because you're getting this extra stream of income, the carbon credits, and whilst you do incur some extra costs, particularly in terms of the auditing costs, they're nowhere near enough to offset the extra income. And so the overall economic efficiency of the wood and carbon project is about twice as good as the wood only project. So there's a higher internal rate of return for wood and carbon, but in addition, the early income received from the carbon credits also means that the project with carbon runs with a positive cash flow for the second half of the project, and also limits the amount of debt in the first half of the project. So the inclusion of carbon credits not only improves the overall economic efficiency of the project, but it improves the cash flow. It makes it more affordable. It means you go less into debt to start with while earning the overall returns. I'd like to conclude the presentation by talking about some other uses of monitoring data. Previous analysis has concentrated on the bluecomb trees at Canberra, but I mentioned earlier that I'd also talk about the other trees, the spotter gums and the sugar gums, which are at an earlier stage. These trees have not yet had commercial thinning, although they have had a thinning to waste early, but they haven't had commercial thinning due to delays caused by COVID lockdowns. So, how can monitoring data help with decisions about thinnings? As I said, the spotter gums have had only one thinning after about 3 years, and we can see that the stocking rate was reduced from about 850 down to 550 trees per hectare. As a result of only having that one thinning and the delay caused by COVID, the DBH growth has now plateaued at about 18 centimetres, and it's been that way for about 3 years now. At the same time, the basal area has plateaued at about 13.9 metres squared per hectare. In fact, it may even be starting to fall a little. There's a well-known trigger for plantation thinning, and that is that when the DBH growth appears to plateau, then one should thin to a stocking rate such that the basal area in metres squared per hectare is less than or equal to about 50% of the DBH in centimetres. This ensures that the trees are not getting too crowded and hence retarding growth. Let's look at what was done in the blue gums at Penumbra on the first and second thinnings. We can see that before the first thinning, the basal area to DBH ratio had increased to about 0.9, but then when the thinning was done, it was brought down to a little bit over 0.5. Over the ensuing years, the basal area DBH ratio slowly increased to about 0.75, and then when the commercial thinning took place, that came down to a little bit under 0.5. So you can see that the thinning that's already taken place in the blue gums at Penumbra basically has been using this ratio of 0.5 as a guideline for thinning. So if we were to do the same thing with the spotted gums, if we look at the current situation, we can see that before the initial thinning, the ratio was up at around 0.75, was brought down to about 0.5, and has now risen again to 0.75. So if we assume that there's going to be no immediate DBH change after thinning, then the stocking rate would need to be reduced from 550 stems per hectare to a bit below 350 stems per hectare to get that ratio down to a half again. Similarly with the sugar gum, they've currently got a ratio of basal area to DBH of about 0.65. And so, assuming no immediate change in DBH as a result of thinning, the stocking rate would need to be reduced from 550 again down to about 350 stems per hectare. So this has been a useful way of just determining when and how much one should thin in order to avoid excessive competition between the trees, which could then reduce the growth in DBH, which is what you're looking for commercial trees in the future. So let me move on to the final conclusions. Clearly, monitoring can be very useful in assessing the past and the present state of the plantations. If you combine monitoring and allometric modelling, that can also be useful for making economic decisions about plantation future options. You use the monitoring to see where you've come from, and the allometric modelling with assumptions to see where you might go in the future, and hence be able to evaluate various options for silviculture and for other decisions. Monitoring can also be used more dynamically to actually assist in making those silviculture decisions based on the relationships between the monitoring variables, such as the basal area and the DBH. I hope this presentation has been useful to those of you who are thinking of getting into agroforestry, whether it be for the various reasons that have been outlined in prior presentations, or for your own special reasons. The monitoring data can help you make decisions which will help you achieve your own objectives.
I think to myself, what a wonderful